The subcommittee will come to order. After recognizing myself and Ranking Member Deutsch for our opening statements, I will then recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute. We will then hear from our witnesses, and without objection, witnesses, your prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome some distinguished guests in the audience. They're here from Israel and are taking part in the State Department's International Visitor Leadership Program. Where are they? There you go, in the back row. Coincidentally, they happen to be here this week as this subcommittee takes its first look at the Iran nuclear deal since President Trump made his announcement last week. We know this is an issue of great importance for our ally Israel, and this committee, and indeed Congress, understands the gravity of the situation for Israel, for the United States, for our friends and allies. So with that, the chair now recognizes herself for such time as I may consume. Less than 2 weeks ago, President Trump announced that he would not certify the Iran deal under the requirements of the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act. All signs leading up to the certification deadline pointed to decertification. In a speech on U.S. policy toward Iran last month, Ambassador Haley laid out the pillars to be considered when determining Iranian compliance with the nuclear deal: the JCPOA itself, the UN Security Council Resolution 2231, and the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act. And I think that this is an important distinction because I know we're going to hear about Iran's technical compliance so that the IAEA and the other P5+1 continue to believe that Iran is in compliance. So how can the president decertify, they ask? Well, even if Iran was in full compliance with the JCPOA, which we know isn't the actual case, Iran has flouted the ballistic missile provisions of the UN Security Council Resolution 2231, and Iran's continued provocations underscore that the current status quo is not in the national security interests of the United States. We have to take a look at the totality of the threats and the current situation, work within the framework that we have, and use the tools we have at our disposal. Let us remember that the president, through his obligation from the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, decided that he could not certify whether the suspension of sanctions related to Iran is appropriate and proportionate to the specific and verifiable measures taken by Iran with respect to terminating its illicit nuclear program. So when the president announced that he would not certify but remain in the deal for now, while allowing for the opportunity to address its flaws to strengthen it, I supported that decision. I think it is a sound strategic decision that allows us an opportunity to address some of the concerns we have with our allies, like the lack of EU designations against Iran for non-nuclear related illicit activity. It gives us an opportunity to correct the record and get some of the promises and assurances that were given to Congress that haven't actually come to fruition. Like when Secretary Kerry testified to Congress that Iran would not be subject to, quote, 24/7 inspections, end quote, and day-to-day accountability. Or when he testified that, quote, when it comes to verification and monitoring, there is absolutely no sunset in this agreement. Not in 10 years, not in 15 years, not in 20 years, not in 25 years, no sunset ever, end quote. Or when we were told that, quote, for the life of this agreement, however long Iran stays in the NPT and is living up to its obligations, they must live up to the additional protocol, end quote. But as we now know, we don't really have 24/7, anywhere, anytime access, especially when it comes to military sites where we haven't even had any access at all. And we know that there are sunset provisions all throughout the deal. And there are dangerous sunset provisions in Resolution 2231, like the sunsets or on the conventional military and missile embargoes, which will more than certainly make the region even more dangerous. We already see Iran sending support and arms to the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, and others. Imagine what we will see when Iran has no restrictions on its ability to acquire conventional weapons or its ability to expand its missile program. We were also promised that Iran's non-nuclear related activity would be addressed. Yet, despite assurances from Secretary Kerry after the JCPOA was agreed to, we have not seen a single designation from the EU on Iran since the JCPOA. Think about that. No new designations, no new sanctions, despite Iran's continued support for terror, its ballistic missile testing, and its abysmal human rights record. There was no threat of decertification from the United States for the first several rounds of certifications, yet there was no EU activity on Iran's other illicit activity. On the contrary, there were billions and billions of dollars in business agreements signed during that period. And I think now, while the President has decertified, this is precisely the opportunity to get together with our allies and see how we can get them back on board on holding Iran accountable for its malign activities. This also gives us an opportunity to raise the bar and do what we should have done in the first place, guarantee that Iran can never become a nuclear weapon state. Because, as I said from the very beginning, the deal set such low benchmarks for Iran that it would be crazy for them not to comply with it, even though it has violated and bent and twisted the deal just to see how far it can go, producing excess only to be bailed out by the U.S. and Russia. Building and operating more advanced centrifuges than it should be allowed to operate. These are just some examples that we know about. With Iran, it would be safe to assume that there are other potential violations, like potential violations of Section T. But our P5+1 partners are right. This isn't just a U.S. unilateral issue. There are many, many interested parties. Unfortunately, some parties, like Russia, are intent on protecting its rogue allies and doing what it can to block any efforts to hold them accountable. Russia has already made it clear that it will not support giving access to Iran's military sites for verification of Section T. I wonder why. We just saw Russia veto a resolution at the UN Security Council that would have extended the investigation by international inspectors to determine those responsible for the chemical weapons attack in Syria. So how do we address this in a way to ensure that the Iranian threat is contained? As we move forward, we must address what is best for our national security interests, the security of our friend and ally Israel, our allies in the Gulf, and the safety and security of the whole region. These are the very same allies who would be most directly impacted by a nuclear Iran, and they're the ones that have publicly expressed support for this administration's willingness to take our Iran policy in a new direction, one that addresses all of Iran's other illicit activities. We can't address Iran's threat without addressing the totality of the situation, and that is what we're here to do today. And with that, I'm pleased and honored to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Ted Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thanks for convening today's important hearing, and thanks to our witnesses for joining us. I'd also like to acknowledge our friends from Israel who are here as part of the State Department's International Visitor Leadership Program as we discuss an issue that's so important to the security of both of our nations. 2 days ago, we marked an anniversary. It's the type of anniversary, though, that we don't celebrate, but we mourn, because on October 23rd in 1983, 2 Hezbollah suicide bombers blew themselves up at the Marine barracks in Beirut, killing over 300 American and French service members, peacekeepers, and civilians. This attack, like so many of Hezbollah's deadly terrorist activities over the past several decades, was sponsored and directed by Iran. And while the United States has since built memorials honoring the victims of that attack, Tehran built a monument honoring the martyrs who perpetrated the attack. When the President gave his much-anticipated Iran strategy speech 2 weeks ago, he rightly reminded the American people about the nature of the Iranian regime, a regime that took control during the Islamic Revolution in 1979 by attacking our embassy and taking dozens of American citizens and diplomats hostage for 444 days. It's a regime that since that time has sought to spread its revolution through proxy militias and terror groups like Hezbollah, a regime that was directly responsible for killing and maiming American soldiers in Iraq, a regime that calls America the Great Satan, calls Israel the Little Satan, supports and equips terror groups trying to wipe Israel off the map. It's a regime that saw Syrian President Bashar Assad torturing and murdering his citizens and sent Hezbollah and the Revolutionary Guard Corps to help him. 500,000 Syrians are now dead, with millions forced to flee their homes and their country. The regime that today is stoking unrest in countries across the region to spread its influence through Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and the Gulf. And this is a regime that in 2009, when Iranian citizens took to the streets to protest election results in a system that is anything but free, responded with a brutal crackdown, including the since famous YouTube video of Iranian college student Nida Agha Soltan being killed in the street. Human rights violations, exporting terrorism, threatening us and our allies. That is why when we saw Iran building a secret and illicit nuclear weapons program, the United States and the world rightly became gravely concerned. It is a terrifying thought to imagine this same regime with control of nuclear weapons. Now, I don't want to relitigate the Iran nuclear deal. I voted against the JCPOA, but we must focus now on the most effective way to counter the Iranian threat in today's reality. The President spoke of working with our allies to counter Iran's malign activities, to impose punishing sanctions outside the nuclear deal, to counter the proliferation of missiles and weapons, and to deny the regime all paths to a nuclear weapon. And while the President was right to give important context on Iran's continued threats and to lay out an overarching strategy, I've been clear that I believe that the President, in threatening to walk away from the deal, will make it harder for us to achieve the changes that we need in policy to strengthen our efforts to combat Iran's dangerous behavior. Not because my views of the deal have changed, but because if we are to tackle Iran's dangerous activities, we must be in a position to lead the world to do it. This whole debate has become a distraction. We should be shoring up support from our allies to go after Iran's malign activity that was never a part of the JCPOA. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, in testifying in the Senate last month, said, and I quote, "Iran is adhering to the JCPOA obligations. The JCPOA has delayed Iran's development of nuclear weapons." But he also said that Iran has not changed its malign activity in the region since the JCPOA was signed. It is precisely that activity that we must aggressively target. The truth is, I know that everyone in this room agrees with the overarching goal. We agree that we cannot allow Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. We know that they cannot be trusted, so we have to maintain intrusive inspections to ensure compliance. We all understand the need to push back against their support for terror and ongoing military expansion in the region. And we all painfully know that more must be done to bring home Americans who are being cruelly and unjustly held in Iran, including my constituent Bob Levinson. And as we look specifically to the JCPOA, I think it's important to understand why the President's top national security advisors have cautioned against walking away from the deal. Unilaterally abandoning the nuclear deal without clear cause would leave the United States isolated and make it impossible to do exactly what the President says that we must: lead the other nations in the world, lead our allies to counter Iran. As Congress debates next steps, I hope that the President will honor his word to work closely with Congress and our allies. The simple truth is that we here in this body cannot simply and unilaterally change an internationally negotiated agreement. That does not mean, however, that we cannot make progress. This administration and this Congress can and should work with our allies to enforce the restrictions on Iran that exist under the JCPOA, to support the IAEA's ability to verify Iranian compliance, and to crack down on all of Iran's malign activities in the region outside of the JCPOA. The fact that so many of the critical restrictions on Iran's nuclear program will begin to expire in the coming years should give us pause for concern. The Iranian regime cannot be trusted with an industrial-sized nuclear enrichment program, which could become possible when the sunsets hit. But we can make firm our commitment to preventing the emergence of an Iranian threshold nuclear state while also honoring our commitments under the JCPOA. And finally, if this President means what he says about working with Congress, I hope that he will send his national security team to meet with me and the other Democrats on this committee who are committed to addressing Iran's dangerous behavior. Countering Iran has long been a bipartisan issue here on the Hill. Let's not allow this current political environment to undermine that. The stakes are simply too high. I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Deutsch. And I have the following members who I will recognize for 1 minute. If you would like to be added, please let us know. It's Mr. DeSantis, then Mr. Cicilline, and Mr. Schneider. So Mr. DeSantis is recognized.
Well, I thank my friend from Florida for holding this hearing. It's important. I think it's pretty clear after living under this deal that if we continue on this course with Iran, 5 or 10 years down the road, we're going to be in the same place that we are with North Korea right now. Only this is a regime motivated by a militant Islamic ideology and an apocalyptic worldview. So simply status quo, I don't think is going to work. I note that for talks about Iranian violations, which they have done, some people try to say that this has been very successful. The fact is, we don't have access to all of their sites. You can't go into their military sites and inspect their military facilities. So the idea that we know what Iran's been up to, we don't. It's not an effective regime. It front-loaded all the benefits to Iran at the outset, and it is not something that is going to lead to a permanently disarmed Iran. So let's fix it. Let's get it right. And I appreciate the President's decertification, but that's just the first step, and we need to do a lot more. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. DeSantis. Mr. Cicilline is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to thank you and Ranking Member Deutsch for this important hearing. I'd like to welcome our Israeli friends who are visiting us here today, and of course, welcome to our distinguished panel, and I look forward to hearing from all of you. One of the most powerful arguments that was made in support of the agreement to prevent Iran from being a nuclear weapon state is that it will strengthen our ability to respond aggressively and effectively to the maligned and increasingly aggressive behavior of this regime. And at the same time, will fortify our partnerships and alliances around the world that are really essential to doing this successfully. And so in that spirit, I am very, very concerned about the President's lack of leadership on this in terms of simply refusing to certify it without any basis for that, creating great uncertainty and undermining, frankly, our ability to effectively work with our partners in the region to respond to the ongoing malignant activities of Iran. And so I will conclude by associating myself with the very thoughtful remarks of my distinguished colleague from Florida, Mr. Deutsch. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for convening this meeting. And as my colleague from Rhode Island, I will associate myself with the remarks from my colleague from Florida. I thought they were wonderful. I want to welcome our witnesses. Thank you for joining us, and also join in welcoming our guests from Israel, Bruchim Habayim. Preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon and curbing their malign regional and global influence is of paramount importance for American national security and the security of our allies. We must be clear-eyed in what actions move us closer and those that move us further away from this objective. While I oppose the JCPOA, now that it is in place, we must aggressively and rigorously enforce it. The urgent responsibility of our government at this time, in conjunction with our partners and our regional allies, is to develop that comprehensive strategy that will commit the necessary resources to work to close the gaps and reduce the risks of the JCPOA, including those sunset provisions. I believe that President Trump's decision not to certify under the terms of INARA jeopardizes the restrictions already in place on Iran's nuclear activity at a time when we should be urgently working to shore up the Iran deal's shortcomings and holding Iran to account for its dangerous behavior outside the agreement. That includes Iran's support for Hezbollah and other terrorist proxies, illicit weapons transfers, ballistic missile program, and its human rights abuses. The President's decision risks isolating us from our international allies at the exact moment we need to work together to accomplish these goals. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today on how best to move forward to put an end to Iran's destabilizing behavior in the region and around the world and ensure Iran is never able to acquire a nuclear weapon. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schneider. And seeing no further requests for time, I will introduce our witness, but I would like to remind the audience members that disruption of committee proceedings is against the law and will not be tolerated. Although wearing themed shirts while seated in the hearing room is permissible, holding up signs during the proceedings is not. Any disruptions will result in a suspension of the proceedings until the Capitol Police can restore order. And I'm so pleased to welcome our witnesses here this morning. I would like to welcome back a good friend of our committee, Dr. Olli Heinonen, who is the Senior Advisor on Science and Nonproliferation at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Prior to this, Mr. Heinonen served as Deputy Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency and as head of its Department of Safeguards. Dr. Heinonen is also a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. We always look forward to your testimony, Dr. Heinonen. Thank you for being here. And next, I'm pleased to welcome back Ambassador Mark Wallace, who is the Chief Executive Officer of United Against Nuclear Iran, OANI. Would that be the right way to say it? What's that? UANI, thank you. And the Counter-Extremism Project. Prior to funding UANI, he served as ambassador to the United Nations, representative for UN management and reform. Thank you for your service, Ambassador. We look forward to your testimony. And finally, we'd like to welcome Dr. Philip Gordon. He is the Mary and David Boies Senior Fellow in U.S. Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations and a Senior Advisor at Albright Stonebridge Group. Dr. Gordon served on the National Security Council as a Special Assistant to the President and as the White House Coordinator for the Middle East, North Africa, and the Gulf region. Dr. Gordon also served as Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasian Affairs. Thank you so much, Dr. Gordon, and we look forward to your testimony. And as I said, your testimony will be made a part of the record, and we will begin with Dr. Heinonen. Thank you.
Chairman Ross Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today about the President's decision, the next steps. I will focus to the verification aspects of the JCPOA, which advocates have characterized as being the most intrusive nuclear inspection regime ever. They also claim that the measures put in place by the JCPOA block all Iran's pathways to a nuclear weapon. To the point of JCPOA verifications, I would like to argue that more forceful implementation and enforcement is needed. As for the deal's ability to block Iran's nuclear weapons pathway, it's not that simple. Indeed, arms control and non-proliferation agreements do not guarantee that the state will be blocked from getting nuclear weapons. They seek to deter it via early detection. Such deterrence is only successful when comprehensive verification measures are fully implemented in a manner that covers both declared and undeclared nuclear activities and facilities in a state. And as some of the terms of the JCPOA begin to sunset as early as in 6 years from now, Iran's nuclear program will be in a stronger position capability-wise with a lower breakout time. To address a number of JCPOA's flaws, the deal's implementation provisions must be made far more robust and meaningful. To that end, several additional measures are necessary, and I would like to make to this end 6 points. First, the IAEA's quarterly reports on the deal's implementation must be enhanced by providing more details on actual implementation of the deal by the IAEA and Iran's adherence to its obligations. Such requests are consistent with Article 5 of the IAEA-Iran Safeguards Agreement, which authorizes the IAEA Board of Governors to be provided with information necessary to the implementation of the agreement. My written testimony lists a number of specific suggestions which would make the reports on Iran more transparent, enabling readers to assess independently and in a timely manner progress made and any obstacles encountered. Second, the IAEA should complete the follow-up actions related to its investigation of the possible military dimensions of Iranian nuclear program. These include site visits, interviews with the scientists, and investigating reason for the presence of uranium particles at Parchin. It is also essential to establish a baseline for future verification that nuclear weapons-related activities have not and will not be reconstituted in Iran. The IAEA has to be more specific in reporting its verification activities related to JPOA's Section T, which prohibits activities which could contribute to the design and development of a nuclear explosive device. Third, the JCPOA and related agreements must apply to all sites related to Iranian nuclear program, with no exceptions to military sites or any other sites. For instance, given the fact that Iran manufactured most of its key components, such as centrifuge rotors and bellows, at military-owned workshops, those sites with necessary expertise and tools should be subject to the monitoring. Fourth, Iran should ratify the additional protocol well before the sunset provisions take effect and before the IAEA issues a broader conclusion about the nature of Iran's nuclear program. In accordance with the IAEA verification principles, a broader conclusion is only drawn when additional protocol is ratified and fully implemented. There is no reason why Iran should be an exception from such a practice. Fifth, Security Council Resolution 2231, limitations on ballistic missiles should be extended to cruise missiles, with the restrictions on missile ranges and payloads should be lowered. Sixth, and the last but not the least, Iran's one-year breakout time should be extended indefinitely into the future while enabling more effective enforcement. By maintaining a breakout time of at least 1 year would ensure that US will have sufficient time to respond to Iran's violations before it crosses the nuclear weapons threshold. Current breakout time is calculated based both on the number and type of centrifuges Iran has installed, as well as known amounts of uranium feed materials available. This is not enough. What needs to be also included in the estimates is the size and types of stocks of uninstalled centrifuges, as well as time to require for their commissioning. We also need to take into account Iran's nuclear capabilities as it continues its R&D on better centrifuges. And as the IAEA is far from determining that there are no undeclared nuclear material and activities in Iran, it makes sense to build in uncertainties and create a buffer into our calculations. In other words, current calculated breakdown time need to be continually evaluated and new caps should be set as appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good recommendations. Well thought out. Ambassador Wallace, pleased to hear from you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman and Ranking Member Deutsch. It's an honor to be on this panel with my two colleagues, and I'd also like to acknowledge my many United Against Nuclear Iran colleagues that are behind me. At the outset, I must express my appreciation to you, Madam Chairman, for your
The
service.
gentleman is recognized for as much time.
I was
as
going to
he
ask.
consumed.
I was going to ask the ranking member for the same indulgence, and I expected the same courtesy for your service to our nation. I've appeared several times and worked with this committee for many years, and this is perhaps my last time in front of you, as you'll be stepping down after a distinguished career. It's too soon to roll out the roasting and all of that business.
Never too soon.
All right. But since I'm originally from Miami, Florida, and we both have a passion about University of Miami football, and we've worked a little bit on Iran over the years, I think it's important that I speak about you for just a little bit of my time, just a little bit. You've been a trailblazer as the first Hispanic woman elected to Congress and the first female chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. But going beyond symbolism, the secrets to your success in Washington are simple. Your kindness, your courage, your decency, and in my opinion, most importantly, and Congressman Deutsch was speaking to this, your moral compass. All far rarer attributes than used to be here in Washington. I'm not going to talk about the time that you accidentally hung up on President Obama after your reelection. You've never been afraid to take the lead on difficult issues. You've bucked your own party on countless occasions, notably being the first Republican to support a bill repealing the Defense of Marriage Act. And in foreign policy, you've become a dictator's nightmare, become dictator's worst nightmare. Fidel Castro once dubbed you the big bad wolf, a term you've worn as a badge of honor. But I'm particularly thankful for your leadership on Iran policy. My friend, we will miss you. I have a feeling that even when you do step down, you won't be quiet or silent, but I don't think I'm going to be here, have an opportunity again before you go, but we will miss you, and I know I speak for everyone in the room on that. Now to more serious business. Henry Kissinger famously said that the Islamic Republic of Iran must decide whether it is a nation or a cause. Nonetheless, those who focus on the role Iran has chosen to play in the world will rightly acknowledge that its leadership has definitely proven to be both a nation as well as a cause. While discussion of the JCPOA may be the first priority for Congress, we must put this into context. Regardless of one's view on the deal's utility, one cannot gainsay the fact that the geostrategic posture of Iran has improved dramatically since its ratification. For both the United States as well as Iran, the JCPOA may prove to be a sideshow. Yes, it is terribly flawed and should be fixed if possible. Nonetheless, the overarching issue facing both the administration and Congress is meeting the challenge that Iranian hegemony now poses in the region. The administration has proposed a policy of rollback. It is Congress's duty to go even beyond this and to both hold the administration's feet to the fire and provide the mechanisms for this policy to be implemented. Only through this strategic reassessment and a robust collaboration between our executive and legislative branches can America's honor be restored and its interests truly be served. President Rouhani's own words on Monday show why this is so important. He said the greatness of the nation of Iran in the region is more than at any other time in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, North Africa, in the Persian Gulf region, where can action be taken without Iran? That's what President Rouhani said. We propose a variety of steps in my more detailed testimony. And one of the things I was going to emphasize here was perhaps suggesting we begin with the FTO designation, the Quds Force, as a solution. We provide a lot of different recommendations, but I'm throwing away the notes for a minute because this is your last time and maybe my last time in front of you. But I want to go to what Mr. Deutsch said and what you, Madam Chairman, said. Our relative advantage, what we have done is we've spent more time talking to business leaders and persons swirling around in the Iran space than anyone else. That's what we know. And I will tell you what was the bipartisan consensus before that you guys led in a bipartisan manner was the notion that there would be ever-increasing pressure on Iran in a systematic way because of the work that you did, and then the Treasury Department and the State Department and the White House would follow ever-increasing that pressure. It worked. I'm not a sanctions apologist. It doesn't work in all countries, but it worked in the context of Iran. Even my friends in the Obama administration lauded the effect of the sanctions regime in bringing Iran to the table. We have to get back to that place, and both of your comments reflect that. I'm happy to testify about a variety of those mechanisms. You all know them. They're different recipes to get to the same meal. But that's where we have to get because of their incredible expansionist activities in the region and the fact that I, too, believe the nuclear agreement was flawed. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for your testimony, and don't do that again. Thank you. Dr. Gordon, we're so pleased that you are joining us, and we'd love to hear from you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for having me, Madam Chairman, Ranking Member Deutsch, and all the distinguished members of the committee. I also want to thank you for the honor of being here, and I look forward to the discussion with my two distinguished colleagues. In my longer written testimony, I discuss also a number of ideas for how the United States can not only ensure that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon, but also how we can more effectively respond to Iran's continued support for terrorism, use of proxies to interfere in neighboring states, development of ballistic missiles that threaten or could threaten us or Iran's neighbors, and persistent human rights violations, which includes, as has been mentioned here, the unjustified and appalling detention of American citizens. And I hope, and I'm sure we will have a chance to discuss all of those ideas, because I think there's a lot we can do that is consistent with the JCPOA. and consistent with keeping the support of our allies, both of which I think are important principles. But I'll use my summary oral remarks here to just make my core point, which is my concern that decertification under the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act risks collapsing a nuclear deal that is working, isolating the United States, undermining American credibility, and, most importantly, freeing Iran from its nuclear constraints. As has been discussed, we all know President Trump announced on October 13th that he would not certify the Iran nuclear deal according to the terms of INARA, even though the U.S. intelligence community, the International Atomic Energy Agency, our European allies, and numerous Israeli security officials all concluded that Iran was complying with it. In making that decision, the President has passed near-term responsibility for the issue to Congress, threatening to terminate, I quote, the JCPOA if Congress and our allies do not take measures to address the deal's many serious flaws. The administration's game plan seems to be to use the threat of walking away from the deal to get Congress and the allies to agree on changes and force Iran back to the table to accept a quote-unquote better deal. And legislative ideas are circulating about how to do that, including addressing ballistic missiles, access to military sites, and extending the limits on Iran's uranium enrichment. Now, I would be the first to say these are all desirable goals. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. The problem is that the United States cannot unilaterally alter fundamental terms of a deal, and I think it's wishful thinking to imagine that our allies or other parties will agree to do so. The JCPOA resulted from more than 2 years of difficult multilateral negotiations and has been endorsed by the UN Security Council and is supported by virtually every country in the world, including countries like Japan, India, South Korea, and others whose cooperation with sanctions and cuts in Iranian oil purchases was essential to get the deal in the first place. Unilaterally amending the provisions of that deal, whether by including new issues or attempting to extend some of its provisions indefinitely, would be considered by all of our allies in Iran as violations of the deal, just as we would consider it impermissible for Iran to unilaterally alter its terms. The leaders of Britain, France, and Germany and the EU have already made clear that they're concerned about the potential implications of the President's decertification, and the EU is already considering activating blocking statutes that would forbid its companies from cooperating with U.S. secondary sanctions. But even if our European allies, along with Russia and China, were somehow persuaded to seek changes, it's hard to see how Iran would ever agree to give up now what it would not give up when the international pressure campaign was at its peak. Of course, if our allies in Iran refuse to amend the deal, the United States can always pull out unilaterally, as the President has threatened to do. Indeed, decertification gives Congress the authority to use expedited procedures to reimpose nuclear sanctions for 60 days from the date of the President's announcement. And even if Congress chooses not to do so, the President, as he reminded us, can reimpose those sanctions at any time. Either of those steps, however, would almost certainly lead to the collapse of the deal. And all of these scenarios, triggered by this decertification decision, I think would have serious consequences. They would isolate the United States, leaving it alone to explain why it killed a deal that they believed was working, and make it difficult to reassemble that sanctions coalition. They would badly damage the United States' reputation as a reliable partner and diminish our ability to persuade other potential proliferators, including North Korea, that the United States would respect the deal, even if they made painful concessions. And most importantly, they would free Iran from all of the restrictions of the JCPOA, including extensive inspection provisions. If we walk away from the deal, Iran will likely assume its frozen nuclear activities, potentially leaving us with terrible alternatives of acquiescing to their advances or using military force to temporarily set them back. I think this approach is particularly unfortunate because I do believe that JCPOA is doing what it was designed to do, which is prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Now, I know some members are concerned about the deal's sunset provisions, which, again, I think we will have a chance to talk about. But remember that even after some of the deal's restrictions expire on uranium enrichment in 2025 or 2030, Iran is permanently obliged never to seek, develop, or acquire a nuclear weapon, permanently committed never to engage in activities that could contribute to the development of a nuclear explosive device, and will continue to adhere to the IAEA's additional protocol, its most comprehensive and intrusive its inspections regime. The bottom line is, if we leave the deal today out of concern about sunset provisions, we will effectively be bringing about immediate sunset with no constraints on enrichment, none on research and development, ballistic missiles, or comprehensive inspections. Let me just end, if I might, with one point about North Korea, which has been brought up and is often brought up in this context by critics of the JCPOA as a potential reason to pull out of the deal. I actually think the North Korea precedent carries a different message. Not long after the Clinton administration had negotiated an agreement in 1994 to stop North Korea's nuclear program, Congress withdrew support for that agreement, rejecting what it considered to be appeasement of a rogue state and insisting that the Clinton administration negotiate a better deal. In part, as a result, we ended up not with a better deal, but with no deal at all, and the nuclear-armed ballistic missile-producing North Korea that we're dealing with today. We will never know if it would have been possible to effectively implement an agreement with a North Korean regime that we know tried to cheat and may have been determined to seek nuclear weapons, but we do know the result of not trying to do so. And I think Congress and the administration should keep that precedent in mind as they consider whether to risk killing a deal that is working now and rolling the dice that they can produce an even better one. Madam Chairman, members of the committee, thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gordon. Thank you for joining us. And thanks all of you for your testimony. Clearly, we have a lot to address here. Dr. Heinonen, I'd like to start with you. I wanted to touch on an issue you raised in your testimony and an issue we heard 2 weeks ago also from David Albright when he testified before our full committee, and that is regarding Iran's likely violations of some of the conditions of Section T. Could you tell us why you believe Iran is likely in violation of Section T, why the IAEA would require access to military sites for its verification, and why IAEA access to military sites in general is critical to being able to certify and verify the JCPOA?
Thank you, Chairman Roslehtinen. When I look the Section T, and I look the conclusions of the IAEA report, I cannot read the report in such a way that IAEA states that Iran is in full compliance with its obligations under Section T. Why I say so? Because what the IAEA just says that it's a monitoring and verifying Section T. It doesn't tell, like we used to say in 2003 when we had the EU3 agreement, where the sentence continued and said that, and there is no indication that Iran is in non-compliance with this undertaking. So the IAEA leaves this a little bit open in the text. And this is why I request or suggest that the text should be more precise. Tell, is Iran fully compliant? Then comes the second part of this exercise, which was also raised by David Albright, is that when IAEA says that it verifies Section T, at the same time the IAEA Secretariat says that they have never visited during this implementation period any military site. So it's difficult to understand which kind of methodology IAEA uses to monitor, for example, these multi-point detonation systems, which are certain types of them are proscribed under Section T. So how can the IAEA come to the conclusion that such activities don't exist? Or is it actually that IAEA has not been yet able to verify? So therefore, it's important that the IAEA comes out of the shell, tells if there is a problem, and then addresses the problem and has those accesses and tells what exactly has been done. And this is, I think, is a very important to the credibility of the reports and to credibility of the verification system. There should be no limitations on accessing those places because Section T is an obligation for Iran to implement.
It's very clear. Thank you so much. Ambassador Wallace, you state that the key piece of leverage that we have on Iran is economic pressure. And as I mentioned, our European friends, and you mentioned it as well, have entered into many deals with Iran worth billions of dollars. In other words, they have significant economic interest in Iran. They have not taken any action against Iran on anything non-nuclear related, partly because they don't want to damage their economic opportunities in Tehran. And as you noted, we don't have the leverage now that we had previously over Iran, but we have leverage with the EU to seek a better deal. So I ask you, how do we leverage this opportunity now to get the EU to both work with us to get a better deal and to take serious action against Iran's non-nuclear related activity?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Look, this committee and the group of people that worked in the Iran space became expert at applying economic pressure to bring Iran to the table and to influence their economy. The charts that we've provided here show economic data associated with the time of sanctions, both before, during, and after the JCPOA, and you can see the effect that you all had and the administration had related to Iran. We have to get back to that place. And I would assert that as Iran has used the JCPOA to promote its activities, they've used the cover of the JCPOA as if everything else is hands-off. We can use our concerns about the JCPOA and our concerns about Iran's behavior to drive the leverage to impose additional economic pressure on Iran. Mr. Deutsch, Congressman Leighton, and you all have done this for years, and that's frankly what led to the JCPOA. And I would just say we have to take a deep breath about the decertification issue. We have a lot of fake debates in Washington these days, and I would suggest that, with due respect, that the decertification was a little bit of a fake debate. The sky didn't fall with certification or not certification. Now we have to deal with Iran's behavior. As Iran did not deal, and our government did not want to include a variety of issues in its negotiations in the JCPOA, it carved out everything from missiles to terrorism to human rights. Let's now readdress those. Let's respect the JCPOA as best as we can. Let's use our allies and our mutual concerns about Iran's behavior and our mutual concerns about the JCPOA and this continuing leverage that we have and that you all can provide by enacting ever-increasing economic pressure to drive supplemental agreements or other pushback of Iran, such as Secretary Tillerson said the other day, why are the Shia militias still in Iraq? We effectively allowed them to digest Iraq like a python eating prey. We have to push Iran back, and we have to use our economic pressure to do that. And it's worked in the past. It can work again, but it requires a bipartisan consensus, and this committee has always been able to do that.
Thank you very much for that thoughtful response. And Mr. Deutsch has opted to be the closer, so we will turn to Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, and again, thank you for holding this very important hearing. To the witnesses, thank you for your insight and sharing your perspectives. Ambassador Wallace, I want to start with you. In your submitted testimony, one of the things you talk about is, and I'll quote you, is the absence of a serious holistic strategy to counter Tehran's non-nuclear destabilizing behavior in the Middle East and beyond. And you lay out a number of steps here, but more broadly, and I'll open this to everyone, what are the dynamics of the absence of that strategy right now? Why is it so important that the United States articulate a clear and comprehensive strategy?
Look, I read everyone's statements as part of my preparation for this, and Congressman Deutsch, I read yours. I agreed with almost everything that you said. And one of the things that you said in answer to Congressman Schneider's was that we've always sort of had a holistic strategy, as part of our approach. What was, I think, good about the President's statement is he outlined that all of Iran's other behavior, and we have to begin to push back on that behavior, and we can do that through economic pressure. It's not clear to me that that has ever been laid out, and I fault the administration under which I served for not laying that out more deliberately. I give some fault to President Obama and his team for not laying that more deliberately. I don't think it was as effectively laid out. This committee, in my opinion, gets it because you've been enacting most of the legislation about it. But when you look at that holistic strategy from their adventurism around the region, from their support of terrorism, their testing of ballistic missiles, certainly the less good provisions of the JCPOA, we can use the tools of legislation, the tools of Treasury sanctions, the tools of State Department sanctions, including the foreign terrorist organizations. It's all about risk. I've talked to these companies. We talk to them, thousands of them. They don't want, they're adverse to risk. We have to explain to them that the risk of doing business in Iran because of its intransigent behavior in the region is too great to go there. If Western businesses flood into Iran to support an IRGC-dominated economy, God forbid we are ever in a circumstance like North Korea, whether it's whatever reason, we will have a much harder time, God forbid, threatening a military intervention, which no one wants, if a bunch of Western businesses and interests are there. So that's why it's important to act now and deal with all the issues that were not dealt with during the JCPOA.
And to expand, and maybe I'll turn to you, Dr. Heinonen, because you touched on this. The urgency to act now, it's not by ripping apart the JCPOA, if I understand what you're saying, Ambassador. It's doing everything around the JCPOA and picking up the pieces that weren't addressed by the narrow nuclear focus on the JCPOA. Is that a correct interpretation?
Sorry, Ali.
Yes, sir, to a great extent. There are authorities which the IAEA Board of Governors has, like the asking more detailed reporting. It has nothing to do with the JCPOA. It's in the normal practices which the IAEA Board of Governors has exercised for years. And that is just a simple resolution by the board. And due to the IAEA Board practices, there is also no veto right. So I think that this is an elegant way to get better enforcement and better reporting. Then missile issues might be different because they fall to the domain of the UN Security Council. But there are ways and means to change the course without renegotiating every aspect of the JCPOA. And also the Joint Committee has certain leverage and certain flexibility to interpretations, particularly when it comes to, for example, to breakout times and constraints there.
And how are we best positioned to make sure that the breakout time, as the sunsets of the various sunsets of the JCPOA fall into place, that the breakout time stays at that 1 year mark, that it doesn't move closer?
This means actually, as I said in my opening statement, continuous follow-up of the developments in Iran when we see that they are developing better and faster centrifuges. Then we need to adjust the conditions that they don't expand the number of installed centrifuges more than that what is required for 1 year breakout time, which in terms, technical terms, is about 5,000 SWUs installed.
Yeah, and I'm running out of time, but to emphasize, that's 5,000 of Generation 1 centrifuges. As they work on their R&D and move into the next generations, that number has to fall. Otherwise, they're going to have 5,000 faster, more efficient, which will shrink the time.
Yes, but thank you. Yes, that's true. Once you have this next generation IR2M, it's only a quarter of that number of centrifuges will be permitted. But then comes to the picture another aspect which the people perhaps not thought thoroughly through, is that you can manufacture these more efficient centrifuges, stock them, have pieces there, and install them quickly. And this one was not as a part of this equation. And as I said in my opening remarks, also the other part is that I don't think the people put too much thinking how we are going to catch if Iran decides to cheat the system by having a clandestine production of those centrifuges. I think the provisions to that end are weak, and therefore you need to have some buffer in your breakout time to overcome that problem.
Thank you. I'm out of time, but just to reiterate what the ranking member said, that highlighting Iran's malign activities, past and present, and currently ongoing even in the context of the JCPOA, I think the time to act and move forward to close those gaps, reduce those risks are right now. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Mr. Ron DeSantis of Florida.
Thank you. Ambassador Walz, looking at some of the reaction to the president's decertification, you saw some of our partners in Europe resounding endorsements of the JCPOA. But then, you look at places in the Gulf, Israel, UAE. I mean, they were happy that the president's taking a different course. It just seems to me that, our European allies, don't face the same threat from Iran as our Middle Eastern allies, and they have a lot of opportunities for business with Iran. And so I guess as we go forward, I think it's good to have as many people on the same page as possible, but how do we get them to be more in line with, I think, the American perspective, the Israeli perspective, the Middle East perspective of people that are actually threatened by Iran?
Thank you, Congressman. Look, it's a very good point. I would say that we tend to gloss over some of the statements of our P5+1 colleagues that have been favorable. For example, Emmanuel Macron, the new leader in France, has said some very strong and encouraging things regarding Iran's behavior and seems prepared to take action to work with us to push back on other areas of Iran's bad behavior. So, as Iran has used this agreement to expand its relevance, its importance, and its destabilizing behavior, with respect, I think the administration can wisely use a bit of our threat of being dissatisfied, not in our national interest, and potentially pulling out of the agreement, to work with our allies like President Macron and our Gulf allies to come up with a good plan to push Iran back in other areas and perhaps to have supplemental understandings about some of the weaknesses of the agreement, perhaps in supplemental agreements.
Now, the EU, they were pretty open in saying, look, if there are other malign activities when the JCPOA was agreed upon, look, we're willing to take action. But have they taken any action since that's happened?
No, and that's, I fully agree with you. But I think that there's been a bit of an absence of leadership with the transition of power, and hopefully we're seeing that here in the United States and in some of the European governments. And I would just say that the statements out of France are quite encouraging, and if I had any say in it, I would say let's immediately reach out to our French colleagues and come up with a plan so that the Iranians don't have bases on the Mediterranean and Bab el-Mandeb.
Dr. Hanoan, it's frustrating when I hear about Iran complying because we don't have access to all of their sites. I mean, can we get access to some of their military sites if we want to do a prompt inspection?
Under the provisions of Safeguards Agreement, this is possible. All territory of Iran is subject to the IAEA safeguards. This is what Iran signed to when it signed the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement with the IAEA, and also the provisions of additional protocol cover the whole country. So what is needed then that the IAEA exercises fully its rights. It certainly has to have a reason to go, and as I listed in my testimony, there are several reasons why one should go to certain military sites. For example, in Iran, to certify on one hand that there is no undeclared nuclear activities going, and there are no undeclared nuclear weapons-related activities going on. So the rights are there.
But we're not in a position, we cannot declare that because we just haven't gone in, right?
I read, indeed, the IAEA report differently. For me, the wording which is there doesn't state that Iran has fully complied with its obligations, the way I read it. I would like to see, as I said before, some additional language to certify that IAEA has really verified all aspects of the JCPOA and the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement.
Now, have you made recommendations about dealing with Iran's ballistic missile program?
Yes, actually, there are two aspects to that. First of all, when we think nuclear weapons program, and look, North Korea as an example. This is like a tent with two poles. You need a delivery vehicle, which is the missile, and then you need the nuclear weapon and the nuclear material itself. And they go hand by hand in tandem. And therefore, when the breakout times get shorter over the time, we need to have more constraints on the missile program to make sure that Iran doesn't dash to nuclear weapon capability. And the only way and mean, in my view, to do it is to limit, first of all, the range of missiles, include also cruise missiles like we are including in North Korea, but for some reason not in Iran. And then perhaps to reduce the payload capacity of those missiles and make them less offensive and more defensive in nature.
Great. Well, obviously, that should have been a part of these negotiations from the beginning, and that was put aside at the very, very outset, and I think it was a huge mistake. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. DeSantis. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ambassador Wallace, there are many members of this committee who have expressed deep concern about the hollowing out of diplomatic posts, and that includes many ambassadorships and assistant secretary positions, and what impact that's having on our diplomatic engagement, coupled with conflicting messages between the President of the United States and his Secretary of State, and sometimes even deferring to the UN ambassador. And I'm wondering whether you could speak to what this sort of disorder, what kind of impact it's having on our Iran policy, and specifically the kind of confusion that it's creating, what that means in terms of our partners or even our adversaries.
It's bad. I agree with you. We should fund and staff those departments. In the interim, our strategic confusion, we should try to take advantage of.
What do you mean by that?
I think that our policy does appear to be confused, but I think that the power of this, and it's not good.
Okay.
I agreed with you.
Well, strategic confusion makes it sound like you think it's actually a strategy that was
I don't know.
Okay.
You're asking me to interpret something that I can't interpret. But what I can say is that
I think that's actually exactly the point. So
right, but what my point is that don't get bogged down in that. You all can use that confusion strategically to advance a narrative, to put pressure on and seek good work with our allies.
I think it's kind of a frightening idea of don't get bogged down with confusion from the administration on what their approach is. Dr. Gordon, maybe can you respond to that? Do you
I
think
just want to
that's a
respond. I don't speak for the
I have
administration.
limited time, Ambassador.
I don't speak for the administration.
I understand that, but I'm just saying that was your argument. I think that's kind of an alarming suggestion, frankly.
It's deep, Congressman, I think it's deeply damaging in a number of ways. Even among our partners and allies, we don't have an ambassador in Saudi Arabia. We don't have an ambassador in Qatar. We don't have an assistant secretary of state for Near Eastern affairs or even a nominee. And we're trying to manage disputes among those critical partners who are vital to containing Iran. So it's damaging in that sense. It's also damaging if you think about it, whether you want, like I do, to find things we can do with allies consistent with the JCPOA, or whether you want to renegotiate it, you need people to do those things. You need experts and sanctions experts and technical experts and scientists and diplomats. And so even if somehow our threat to pull out of the deal gets people to agree to talk, and what the Europeans can do and what their Gulf friends can do and what Israel can do, you need effective diplomats who can follow up.
Thank you, Dr. Wood. Dr. Hannan, pronouncing that correctly. As Mr. Deutsch mentioned, Monday marked the 34th anniversary of the Beirut bombings. In my home state, we lost 9 Rhode Islanders in those bombings, and we commemorate that every year. And so I'd like to ask you, as we think about Hezbollah's continued global terrorism, support for the Assad regime, their nefarious activities in Lebanon, their stated aim to destroy the state of Israel, how can we, what can we do to best sever the ties between Iran and Hezbollah and Iran's support for Hezbollah? What can and should we be doing?
Sir, thank you very much for the question. This goes a little bit beyond my scope, so I think that maybe Dr. Wallis wants to address to that. But I have been spending last 20 years of my time in Middle East, and I have been, seeing this coming, and I see it as a very disturbing factor. In particular, if it turns out that at one point of time, Iran also has nuclear weapons capability or is a threshold state with a very short dash to nuclear weapons capability. Those problems which we see here now in terms of terrorism and behavior in the region get even more serious. This is the only thing, in my view, which I can state to this topic. Thank you.
Ambassador Wallace, do you have thoughts?
Let's sanction the Quds Force. Let's designate them a foreign terrorist organization. The Quds Force is generally, it's more complicated than that, the vehicle under which Iran provides support and largesse and vice versa to the Hezbollah. Let's take that step. It's controversial. I don't think it is. I think we should begin thinking about designating the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization. I think some of our allies would have some heartburn about that because the IRGC technically runs the military of Iran. It would be the first time that we had taken such an action. But I advocate that we should consider that. We should debate that and have that on the table. That should be part of the ever-increasing consideration of sanctions. But today, right now, let's designate the Quds Force as an FTO and Qasem Soleimani as its head, and let's start pressuring and convincing companies and businesses around the world that if you do business that touches on the IRGC and its Quds Force, that you run the risk of doing business with a foreign terrorist organization. That would provide quite a chill, in my opinion, at least a first step of a good freeze.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Cicilline, and so pleased to yield to my Florida colleague, Mr. Mast.
Thank you very much, Chairman. You know, I want to look at a different side of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It has been readily available for everybody to see, especially in this past week, how the Obama administration, Hillary Clinton, the Clinton Foundation, have all worked to sell uranium to Russia. I would personally call it proliferation. So I want to go with a few questions related to that. Would you say, and this is open to any one of you, that the JCPOA does allow for Russia to expand its ties with Iran?
I think one of the problems with the JCPOA, and we have to remember, the JCPOA, 58 senators were generally, even though we didn't have a vote on it, were not supportive of the JCPOA. I think it was 269 or 270 members in a bipartisan manner. And the JCPOA, one of the criticisms at the time, and it did have strengths, was that it really was a narrowly constructed nuclear non-proliferation agreement plus a little bit more. It didn't touch on issues like that, Congressman, and I think that was one of the problems that we had, and that was one of the issues that we had, that Iran is the first trip that representatives of Iran made after signing the JCPOA, in my opinion, was to Moscow, because they were looking for allies in the region, whether it be Syria or otherwise. So I think that's one of the weaknesses that you identify, and you're absolutely right. That's a problem.
It was stated by the Russian Foreign Ministry that the deal was based upon what was articulated specifically by Vladimir Putin. That was a quote from the Russian Foreign Ministry after the deal was brought about. I would like to ask you, as part of the JCPOA, did it lift sanctions on Russian sellers of illicit munitions, illicit arms? Was that part of the JCPOA?
Did it lift sanctions on Russian sales of illicit arms? It provided a pathway to lifting a UN Security Council resolution on arms sales to Iran, which was implemented in the context of U.S. leadership bringing the world together to deal with this particular set of issues. And having been involved in the negotiations, I can tell you that all of these things were desired by the United States. We would obviously have loved to have a deal that prevented arms sales to Iran forever, that included ballistic missiles, that included Iranian intervention in the region. But you have to remember that the reason we were able to get this international sanctions coalition into place is that we were able to forge a consensus that remarkably, in fact, even included Russia, to deal with the nuclear threat, which was the predominant issue of most concern to us and everybody else involved.
Does Russia build and operate reactors in Iran?
There is one Russian built and operated reactor at Bushehr, and then Russia takes the spent fuel and ensures that it's not a proliferation risk.
Is part of the deal that it allows shipments of uranium from Iran to Russia?
Well, when Iran got rid of 97% of its uranium stockpile, part of that process was getting rid of that uranium and sending it to Russia, which we thought was a positive thing.
So now Russia is acquiring both the uranium of Iran and the United States of America.
Russia is a nuclear weapon state, which has lots and lots of uranium and enriched uranium. And again, we thought it was a better thing to have Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium in Russia which has more than enough uranium, than in Iran. So that was an important positive part of the agreement.
From one known adversary to another. Would you say that this deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, brings Iran closer to the West or closer to Russia?
I don't think it necessarily brings Iran closer to the West, because that wasn't the point of the deal. The point of the deal was to ensure that Iran, which when the deal was negotiated was on the verge of a potential weapons capability, we assessed a couple of months away from having enough fissile material for a bomb. The deal was designed to deal with that. Now, if we had a way to also make it less of an adversary, and again, I think we'll come back to, and I've already discussed some of the many other ways in which Iran is a threat to the United States, but the deal wasn't designed to bring Iran closer to the West. It was designed to deal with the nuclear threat.
I thank you for your answers. I think that's always an issue when we have deals that we're bringing about that do not benefit the United States in a way that I think most of us would like to see. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mast. And now we turn to Mr. Liu of California.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank the witnesses for your time and your testimony today. I want to follow up on the comments from the gentleman from Florida. I'm pleased to see there's bipartisan recognition that Russia is not our ally and Vladimir Putin is not our friend. I hope my colleagues across the aisle will contact the President of the United States and ask him why he blew off a deadline to impose sanctions on Russia, especially after Congress passed a bipartisan law on sanctions. Now, I'd like to ask about your comments, Mr. Ambassador, about strategic confusion. What you call strategic confusion, I call total and utter dysfunction at the highest levels of the Trump administration when it comes to foreign policy. Specifically to the Iran deal, we see the president say that he wants to get out of the Iran deal. In fact, when he campaigned, he said he was going to rip up the deal. At the same time, we have Secretary of Defense Mattis saying it's in the best interest of the United States to stay in the deal. We have Secretary of State Tillerson saying it's in the best interest of the United States to stay in the deal. So today, on Wednesday, October 25th, I have a very simple and basic question. What is the official policy of the Trump administration on the Iran deal? Do they want to get in or stay in, or do they want to get out?
If you think you got the guy here that's going to try to defend that, you're wrong. And no matter the number of Bibles I'm going to swear on, I don't have an answer for you. So you can pass it to somebody else. I don't speak for the administration.
Any other members of the panel, can you explain the official policy of the Trump administration as we sit here today? It's a very simple question.
I think Phil should take it.
I mean, if you can't, it's fine. Just say you can't explain it. I get that. I can't.
Speak for the Trump administration. You mean broadly? I mean, as I articulated in my opening
Look,
statement,
we're reading the same Twitter account. We're reading the same statements from the same secretaries. So I just want your view as experts. What
I
is the
was
Trump
only asking if
administration's
you were asking
policy
broadly policy or towards this decertification?
towards this Iran deal? What is their official position?
Well, as I said in my opening statement, my understanding of their game plan is to threaten to leave it, to force Congress and allies to agree to change it, and I expressed my own skepticism that that's possible and my concerns that that game plan, while I think the ambassador is right, that in the short term the sky's not falling and there's no reason to believe the deal collapses immediately because of that step, I worry that it has set in place a process that could lead to the collapse of the deal with nothing in place to follow it, so I'm very worried about it.
Doctor, do you have, I'm just curious about your view as an expert, if you know what the Trump administration's official policy is on the Iran deal as we sit here today.
The way I read these pieces, I was a long time in the information analysis in the IAEA. My conclusion is that the United States of America government is reviewing the situation and is looking forward what to do, and to that extent has also asked the opinion of the Congress.
Thank you. So let me tell you why strategic confusion, or as I call total and utter dysfunction, is harmful to the United States. It makes it very confusing to the American public, to members of Congress, to you on the panel, to world leaders, to understand what our strategy is, what our policy is. And moreover, it totally undercuts the credibility of Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. So when Secretary of State Tillerson now talks to members of Congress, if he were to talk to you, if he would talk to world leaders, we don't actually know who he is speaking for. Is he speaking for himself? Is he speaking for the president? What policy is he advocating that has any support behind it? And that causes massive problems and makes it very hard to engage in diplomacy. And the dysfunction also has resulted in numerous positions not being filled. I know that the vacancy for the Assistant Secretary for International Security and Non-Proliferation has not been filled. Do you know, as of today, has the President nominated anyone yet for that post? So yes or no, or you don't know, anyone on the panel? I don't think he has. I think that is a problem, and I hope you would agree that that probably is a pretty important position if we're dealing with nuclear non-proliferation issues. So it is my hope that this administration gets its act together, and for anyone who believes strategic incompetence and confusion is good, I just have one rhetorical thought experiment. Think for yourself, would any of you have wanted unpredictability, confusion, or dysfunction during the Cuban Missile Crisis? I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. And now I'm pleased to yield to Mr. Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the panel for participating. I've made my views on the JCPOA very clear in this committee. To inject $150 billion in previously frozen assets into the Iranian economy and the lifting of sanctions, which by most measures will allow that economy to grow at a clip of 10 to 12% per year, to what most of us would agree is the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism. No anytime, anywhere inspections, an agreement that has not been signed by a single government official in Tehran, not a single member of the Iranian parliament, violating the spirit of the agreement at best on a regular basis through its ongoing support of regional proxies and their ongoing ballistic missile tests. So given all of those factors, my question is, does our faith in this agreement depend upon our belief in the credibility in the Iranian regime that they are going to keep their word?
I would say a couple of things. First, no, it doesn't rely on trust that they will keep their word. It relies on enforcement. I think you have to assume, because they've cheated in the past, that they're capable of cheating again. So I don't think it's a matter of trusting, and that's why the extensive inspections regime that they're committed to forever. We talked about sunsets. One thing that wouldn't sunset was the intrusive inspection regime to assure that they can never get a nuclear weapon. So I guess, no, it doesn't. It doesn't.
If I may, just to slightly disagree with that, I think that any agreement of this sort requires trust, and we've heard statements that they won't allow inspections of military facilities. We're relying on them to sign the additional protocol down the road. And to say that, with all due respect to my friend Ali, that inspections are the absolute panacea, I think is wrong, just because, with due respect, I don't think there's ever been an inspections regime that's truly prevented a power from going nuclear if that power wanted to go nuclear.
But when we talk about imperfections, of the inspection regime, we have to compare it to the inspection regime that we would have in the absence of the JCPOA and the absence of the additional protocol. In fact, no country operating under the additional protocol has ever gotten nuclear weapons. And keep in mind that if we were to say, this inspection regime is imperfect and therefore we don't like the JCPOA, we would go from this inspection regime with additional monitors, 24/7 cameras on declared nuclear sites, and the ability to access even military bases if there is a basis for it. We would go from that regime to no regime whatever, kind of like the one we've had in North Korea for 20 years. And that's the case for the JCPOA.
Mr. Gordon, with all respect, how are we not relying on the credibility of the regime to enforce an agreement that does not allow for any time, anywhere inspections? How is there not an element of us being forced to put our faith in that regime for this agreement to work?
Well, because we're monitoring. I mean, I think the anytime, anywhere is sometimes the wrong standard to think about. I mean, the idea, once again, would we like to have American intelligence personnel on Iranian military bases 24/7? I think, of course, we would. But that's never existed, other than the context of a defeated power and an occupation. That has never happened and will not happen, and I don't think any of us believe that could be the standard in Iran. what was important and remains important is that if we have a basis for suspecting that they are not living up to their obligations, not only not to acquire a nuclear weapon, but not even to seek or develop or do R&D on weaponization activities, if we have any basis for that, then we need access to those bases and have it. And as Oli said, the inspection regime provides for that. I actually think we have a better chance of getting that necessary, and if not, we have a crisis, and then all of the means are available, just as if we didn't have the agreement. I think we have a better chance of getting that access if we are living up to the regime, the JCPOA on our side, and can go to the IAEA and our allies and explain why we need access, rather than if we give the impression that our objective is actually to force the Iranians into a crisis and blow up the regime.
And is it your belief that Iran's ongoing support of regional proxies is not undermining the spirit of this agreement at best?
Like I said, the agreement was to stop them from getting a nuclear weapon. I want to be absolutely clear that their support for proxies and terrorism in the region is something that should be an absolute priority of the United States to deal with. And there are ways of doing so consistent with the JCPOA. I would submit respectfully that not having the constraints on the nuclear program, unless we could also get every other American objective vis-a-vis Iran, could lead to us having neither. And that's why I think we need to deal with the proxies and support for terrorism, but it's a good thing to be constraining their nuclear program in the meantime.
My time has expired, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Boyle is recognized, and I want to say on behalf of Ambassador Wallace, a fellow Kane, and I, we look forward to the University of Miami beating Notre Dame coming up pretty soon.
Madam Chair, I regret that you just uttered fake news during this subcommittee, and I look forward to Notre Dame beating your alma mater. But at any rate, thank you.
That would be huge.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, my line of questioning or commentary is probably segues nicely from what Dr. Gordon was last saying. You know, one of the criticisms or shortcomings that I saw in the JCPOA was that it didn't address Iranian funding of terrorism, its funding of Hezbollah, its involvement in Syria, what it's doing to support Hamas, et cetera. Now, advocates of the JCPOA pointed out that, well, wait a minute, that's not what it was designed to do. This is just dealing with the narrow issue of the nuclear program, and that outside the JCPOA, nothing prevented Congress from acting in those areas. Once we signed up to the JCPOA with the international community, and it took effect, we moved forward in this committee on a pretty strong bipartisan basis, and in Congress on a strong bipartisan basis, and passed pretty strict sanctions this summer to do exactly that. So to now revisit the JCPOA a couple of years after the date in which it went into effect, after we've already released approximately $115 billion, I'm not sure what advantage we get out of that at this point in time. Also, when keeping in mind that the Iranian issue is not the only issue out there, that in my view, the single most important foreign policy issue we're dealing with at the moment is North Korea, I'm not sure how it helps our efforts to negotiate North Korea away from developing its nuclear program if at the same time we are abrogating an agreement we made on a nuclear program with Iran. So given all of that, and as we're wrestling with this here in the United States and in the Capitol, those of us who were not enthusiastic of the deal or those of us who were mixed, I'm curious what the view is in Europe. President Macron in France made a statement that he saw shortcomings in the JCPOA, especially with the sunsets, and wanted to work on that. But there's obviously been no enthusiasm for the approach that President Trump has signaled with unilaterally pulling out of the deal. So I'm wondering if any of you could comment on what the view is in Berlin, Paris, et cetera.
I would be happy to start and let them speak for themselves. Only hours after the president's statement, the leaders of Britain, France, and Germany, May, Macron, and Merkel, put out a very strong and clear statement that they took note of the president's decision. They were concerned, which is not a word that they use often about U.S. foreign policy steps, they were concerned about the potential implications of decertification, and they remained fully committed to the deal which they thought was working. So that doesn't mean it's wrong to say that Europeans have concerns about certain aspects of it, are willing to work with us on issues beyond the JCPOA, including terrorism, ballistic missiles, and they are, and we should follow up on that. But they've been absolutely clear that having participated in these difficult 2-year negotiations with all of the different parties, they know that you can't just revisit that in the way you said, Congressman, and just ask for those issues to be unilaterally revised. So that's why I said earlier in my remarks, I think it is wishful thinking to imagine that we can amend, fix, or change this deal. Can we look at other ways to deal with issues that were not in the deal? Absolutely, and we should. But I think Europeans have been absolutely clear, and that's why I think it's a dangerous path we've headed down, because if the president's standard really is get Congress and the allies to change the deal, or he will, quote unquote, terminate it, then I think we're in trouble.
I'll just say in the brief time I have left, I was very concerned myself, or disturbed by a quote the German foreign minister gave to a German newspaper. But essentially, President Trump's behavior over the Iran deal, quote, will drive us Europeans into a common position with Russia and China against the USA, close quote. I'm wondering if we're seeing any sign of that happening.
I don't think so. I think there's obviously some real concerns in a bipartisan manner and on the international stage about confusion in American policy. I don't speak for the administration. I said I don't want to. I'm not going to. And I think that that's a problem. We've seen definitely some signs out of Europe. Look, the Europeans are smart. They're sophisticated. They're concerned about Iran. There's some big business interests in Germany that they have longstanding business interests. The French, I don't want to speak for them. I have interactions with a lot of these governments. But I think the French are very clear-eyed in the concerns about some of the shortcomings of the deal, about perhaps using the leverage that we could have or gain to have supplemental or additional concerns. But more importantly to the French, I think, and I think something that we need to think about is how do we use the levers of power that we have or can build through actions in this Congress, for example, to put pressure on Iran, to roll back Iran in other areas of its activities. I think that there is a coalition waiting to be built in that area, in my opinion.
Can I just add briefly? We're alone on this right now. I don't speak either for the Europeans or the Trump administration, but the Europeans have spoken for themselves. And that is the risk of this strategy. If they don't join us in following the president's demands, the United States, which was only successful on this issue because we got our international partners on board. I mean, the United States has had bilateral sanctions on Iran for decades.
Since 79.
Sorry?
Since 79.
We don't trade with Iran, we don't invest in Iran, we don't have an ambassador in Iran. And we saw the result of those sanctions, all too limited, especially where the nuclear program grew and grew even when we had sanctions on. They became effective when we started to get international support, and Congress had a lot to do with that, and we brought Europeans together, and then miraculously even got Russians and Chinese, and as I mentioned in my testimony, India, South Korea, Japan, everyone to agree on a focused issue, which is stopping the Iranian nuclear program. And that's a fantastic position for the United States to be in when we need that leverage. And the risk with this approach, I fear, is that we throw it away and we become the issue. The issue is not Iranian compliance, the issue is American compliance.
If I may, the notion that our sanctions were effective from '79 for decades is wrong. Our sanctions were not enforced, somewhat feckless. If you look at the chart, if one of my colleagues could put up the chart, when this Congress, this committee became engaged and others became engaged, an active Treasury Department, and truly put on really effective sanctions and tested the theory that sanctions could be effective in certain types of governments that were vulnerable, it had a profound effect on the Iranian economy. And I think all of us can agree that at least that it in part drove Iran to the table because they were feeling financial pressure. We can debate about how much financial pressure they were feeling. I think a lot. I think some of my colleagues in the previous administration would differ slightly. I think they'd all agree that they were feeling some pressure. But those sanctions were effective. I think we have to get back to the place in this Congress where all of you, or most of you, joined together to put together a sanctions plan that ever increased pressure and drove economic indicators during the time periods that are shown in these charts.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Boyle. Go Canes. And now, so pleased to recognize Mr. Kinzinger, and thank you for your service, as I always say.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for being here and taking some time with us today. I'll get back to this issue. I do want to say on the front end, just because it's apropos to what was just being discussed, sometimes leadership starts with standing alone, standing by yourself. I think if we decertify this deal, there's all kinds of questions of what happens. I think there's no question of what happens in 10 years, even if we certify this deal over and over again, which is we either have to basically bomb Iran to keep them from getting nuclear weapons, or they're going to get nuclear weapons. Or we have to somehow come back to the table and compel them to yet another nuclear deal. It was actually pretty interesting and pretty eye-opening. Jake Sullivan, a couple weeks ago, was in front of the committee, and I asked him, did you guys put ballistic missiles on the table in your opening gambit of this attempt to get a deal? And he said, yes, absolutely. But we knew the Iranians would never agree to it, so we pulled it off. So that actually reminded me of my thought that, and I think I said this to Secretary Kerry or somebody before us, which is you're going to get a deal at any cost. Because Secretary was saying, we're willing to walk away from the table. No, they weren't. The Obama administration was not going to walk away from the table, and they would give in whatever they needed to give in order to get a deal, including saying that, hey, in 10 or 15 years, this thing's off the table, and we're going to be back to nukes. So if we look at a 100-year line of history from today to 100 years from now, a 10-year freeze on a nuclear program's cool for the next 10 years, but after the 10 years, so year 11 to 90, it doesn't make sense. This is the issue we're dealing with in North Korea, too. How do you, when you give somebody the ability to go nuclear, how do you ever enforce a non-proliferation treaty? And the other point that was made is about Europe. Look, I have a lot of respect for Europe. I'm a big believer in using multilateral approaches. I'm not a unilateralist. But at the same time, Europe has been rushing for the economic benefits of the Iran deal. So this idea that Europe is somehow just genuinely concerned, maybe to an extent, but there's also a business reason for that. And that included when we leveraged sanctions against Russia. They were resistant to that despite Russian invasion of Crimea, Russian occupation of Georgia, and a continued fight in Eastern Europe because it's about the economy. For the entire panel, though, I'm going to shift. I was horrified this week to see the images of a 1-month-old baby starving to death in Syria. What we have in Syria is one of the largest human tragedies, at least in my lifetime, hopefully in my lifetime. 500,000 dead people, 550,000 innocent children. So in addition to supporting Assad's barbarianism, Iran is more emboldened in its efforts to dominate Syria and its efforts to build a regional land bridge. And I can only conclude that they're going to, if successful, use that to threaten Israel and other allies we have. We didn't do enough or really anything in the last 8 years to sound the alarm on Iran's destabilizing activities in Syria and Iraq, I might add, of which I fought against them in Iraq, of which I also need to remind people that about a quarter of American soldiers that gave their life in Iraq were a result of Iran or Iranian technology. But I think now is the time to finally implement a broad strategy that counters Iran effectively in Syria. Mr. Ambassador, I'll start with you, but it's a question for all three of you. No one should have to see those images of starving children caused by an Iranian-backed Assad regime anymore. I also met with a survivor of torture in Assad's prison, and as he was bawling to me and recounted some of the stuff that I think the devil himself would look at and go, man, I couldn't have even come up with anything that twisted. As he recounted this stuff to me, I realized this is like the shame of our generation to ignore what's been going on. But what specific pressure can we apply to the Iranians, be it sanctions or actual military engagement, to have an impact towards slowing their advance across the entire country, Mr. Ambassador?
Look, I agree with a lot of what you said, probably all of it. The reality is that Iran, in politics today in Washington, where we oversell things, with due respect to my colleagues in the previous administration, one of the points of oversell, and look, I get it, it's just the way it is here now, was that they said somehow, President Obama on Implementation Day said that Iran would rejoin the community of nations. I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember the quote exactly. But what Iran did, that wasn't true. It didn't work out that way. I believe that President Obama genuinely believed that. I believe he was wrong about that. Iran ran right to Damascus and right to Moscow. And look, for a country that complained about the horrific chemical attacks that Iran suffered at one point, and now very comfortably are allowing their proxy, Assad, to do it to his own people, I think speaks volumes about their lack of sincerity about building off of the nuclear agreement to whatever term you rejoin the community of nations. So I think what you propose, and I think what we're hearing, I hope is a bipartisan consensus, is that we have to push them back. And we have to say to them that if you're going to have militias there, if you're going to have your proxies there, we're going to continue to ratchet up pressure and do things and potentially take action against those proxies if they stay there. We're not going to allow you to have, for example, that land bridge. We're not going to allow you to have the Bab el-Mandeb. We're not going to allow that to happen. We want to avoid any military action, of course, and we should use our economic pressure and our leverage. I believe that our coalition, there is a coalition out there, actually. But I do also believe that the 2008 financial crisis showed that, regrettably, or favorably in this case, that most of the international banking transactions and financial transactions flow through New York, and we have a lot of power to control that. Let's use our leverage. Let's use things that aren't bullets and bombs, at least at the first point, to try to stop Iran and push them back. Your points about pushing them back are dead on, sir.
Thank you. And I'm sorry the other two I won't because I'm over time, but I appreciate you guys being here, and thank you for your time, and I'll yield back.
And thank you for your leadership on always calling attention to the crisis in Syria. Humanitarian toll is beyond comprehension. Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you for bringing this panel together. I don't know that there's bipartisan consensus, Ambassador Wallace. I'm not asking you a question. I'm reacting to what you said. I take a fundamentally different approach. I support the JCPOA. Its goal was quite focused on one thing, pushing Iran back from the nuclear threshold as a nuclear threshold state. Estimates were they were within a year or so. Dr. Gordon, how far away are they now?
Now they are at least a year away, and at the time they were even less than a year, 2 or 3 months.
Dr. Heinen, and I assume that's a Finnish name? Yes, that's right. Kiitos. There were metrics set in JCPOA, enriched uranium down to 3.68, I think. Have they met that goal? Yes or no?
IAEA says that they are verifying and monitoring the Iranian or the JCPOA. IAEA has not explicitly provided the numbers there. They have given the storage amount of uranium hexafluoride pure, which is there.
But we do know that...
For example, they have not given the amount of such material which is placed in...
My understanding from international sources is they have pretty much met the metric set on enriched uranium and shipping it out of the country to Russia, as was indicated. Centrifuges, they've reduced the number of centrifuges to the level specified in the agreement. The plutonium production reactor, they've cemented it over, as was required in the agreement. They have allowed the inspection of nuclear facilities to, my knowledge, unimpeded. Is that correct, Dr. Gordon, or have they, in fact, impeded some of those inspections? Now, we're arguing over non-nuclear, or we think non-nuclear military facilities, and that's an argument worth having. Now, Dr. Gordon, historically, when John Kennedy proposed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty to try to prevent both the Soviet Union and the United States from open-air testing of nuclear weapons, did he insist that all other objectionable Soviet behavior be included before we signed that agreement? No, he didn't. I'm sorry?
No, he did not.
When Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon negotiated the SALT I agreement, did they insist that all negative behavior on the part of the Soviet Union or objectionable behavior on the part of the Soviet Union be incorporated into that agreement?
They did not.
SALT II.
Nope.
Why would that be?
Because it would have been unrealistic to achieve all of those goals. And
Has
we
there
wouldn't have
ever
come up
been
with having
a
either.
comprehensive, all-inclusive behavioral agreement between two nations or a multilateral entity and a nation that you're aware of
Not that I
historically?
can think of, no.
No. So we're dealing with a red herring. When my friends on the other side of the aisle, who never supported JCPOA and who believed that, or certainly said that, in fact, approving the agreement would accelerate Iran's move toward a nuclear threshold state, and therefore the agreement itself, as Benjamin Netanyahu said before a joint session of this Congress, uninvited by the chief executive of the country, nonetheless here, that actually approving the agreement would be an existential threat to Israel. I would propound that actually the existential threat to Israel is less on a nuclear basis today than it was when he gave that speech. And what's the difference? The approval of the JCPOA. Dr. Gordon.
I'll say one thing on that, because you brought up both the Iraq heavy water reactor and Israel, and we have some friends from Israel here with us today. As I mentioned in my written testimony, I recall quite vividly in 2013 meeting with Israeli national security officials who were deeply worried about the scheduled completion of the heavy water reactor, because once live, it could produce enough plutonium for 1 or 2 weapons per year. That reactor is now dismantled and its core is filled with concrete, and the Israelis don't have to worry about the fissile material that by now would have accumulated to the point, if we didn't have the deal, for 6 nuclear weapons.
So my time is almost up, but I fear this administration and the decision by the President not to certify, and some of the criticism still being echoed here as if nothing had happened, as if there were no implementation metrics, is going to talk ourselves right out of a nuclear agreement that's working, not perfect, not permanent. We can work toward that, and will damage the credibility of the United States that hosted this agreement. Remember, our adversaries as well as our allies were part of this agreement. We will never get Russia and China to the table again if we renounce this agreement, nor will we ever convince Iran that it's worth dealing with the United States on these or other issues, the very ones enunciated by my friends on the other side of the aisle. If you want to make any progress at all, and I take Ambassador Wallace's statement to heart, don't overpromise. Don't overpromise. But to denigrate this agreement as if it hadn't achieved something quite fundamental, quite important as a building block, to me is a disservice to the agreement and is going to talk ourselves right into a nuclear Iran when we're facing the nuclear threat from North Korea. I yield back.
Mr. Connolly, before I acknowledge your yielding back, Dr. Heinonen had put his hand up. I'm wondering.
Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Heinonen. I didn't see you. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Madam. And sir, I have a little bit different view with regard of the capabilities of the JCPO. We have to look at in a 10-year time frame and longer time frame. It's true, as you said, that so-called breakout time has now shortened. It's less than 10 years, sorry, less than 1 year. It's not actually past the 1-year mark if you take all those items which I mentioned in my written statement. But I think where we need to focus now is this sunset clause after years 10, 8, and 10, how to face the situation when Iran starts steadily to go closer and closer to this breakout capability, which will be much, much less than 1 year. I recall even President Obama saying somewhere year 12 or 13, it's a question of weeks. And I think this is what the people try to look now, which kind of measures can be taken, perhaps without abandoning the agreement, but additional measures to make sure that the deal fulfills its long-term goal, which is deny from Iran access to nuclear weapons. Then a tiny small clarification.
Dr. Heinonen?
Did you know, sir, that there is a high-enriched uranium in Iran today? It's a U.S. origin, spent fuel in Tehran research reactor. JCPOA says that Iran intends to ship it out. I think we should encourage them to ship it out.
Dr. I want to just respond real briefly. I agree with you that we got to deal with those sunset provisions. But how do you deal with it? Let me just say to you, my experience in life is when you threaten somebody having already reached an agreement and saying, we've changed our minds, we want to change the terms, we're going to renounce that, and now we're going to make you do it forever, the incentive for the other party to agree to that is quite limited, especially when it knows that our credibility is now so damaged that reinstating a sanctions regime with international cooperation is probably not going to happen. And so I think you got to build on what we've built on to get to the sunset provisions addressed. Fully agree with you, but how we do it matters a lot. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Connolly. And so pleased to yield to my friend from Missouri, the Ambassador Ann Wagner.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for holding this hearing today. The Iran nuclear deal was, as Ambassador Wallace wrote, does not prevent a nuclear Iran. And as Dr. Heinonen wrote, the time to fix the deal is now, not 6 years from now, when the deal's sunset clauses have helped Iran establish itself as a permanent threshold nuclear state. I believe that Iran's centrifuge R&D program is an example of Iranian cheating on the deal. And I'm also concerned that the IAEA continues to face access issues on the ground. Dr. Gordon, you argued that sanctions relief has not fueled Iranian expansion in the Middle East. My understanding is that the $1.7 billion that the Obama administration paid to Iran during the 2016 ransom scandal were funneled straight into Iran's defense budget. I believe I read that in the FDD, the Foundation for Defense and Democracy report on Tehran's budget. Can you or others on the panel briefly explain if this was the case? And if it is the case, I don't understand how this money won't be used to destabilize the Middle East. Sir?
Sure, thank you. Money is, of course, fungible, and so I don't think there's any precise way of saying, you know, $1 went to one thing or another went to another. Clearly, if Iran is receiving money or having access to its frozen assets or able to sell oil, it gets more money and it can use it for nefarious purposes, which is a problem. I think everybody would agree that more fungible money for Iran to use for these purposes is a bad thing. I don't think, though, we can say there's some direct link to any particular asset that Iran has access to and its funding for these sorts of...
It's still $1.7 billion that they've used.
That is correct, and Iran has a budget of tens of billions of dollars.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. Dr. Heinonen, you drew attention to Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, his comment that Iran will emerge from the nuclear deal with a stronger nuclear program. But I didn't see any comment in your statement about your opinion on the administration's decision not to certify the nuclear agreement. I'm eager to hear your thoughts, especially in light of your study of the Iran regime's intentions. Sir.
I didn't take any position to decertification. It's not in my domain. I'm looking at the implementation of JCPOA. Does it meet the requirements that it denies Iran's access to nuclear weapons in a short term and in the longer term? In a short term, we are slightly better off in terms of the verification, but there are still important loopholes which need to be fixed in order to make it solid. It doesn't mean that you need to throw the agreement away. There might be ways and means to do some complementary measures. But the issue is the long term. This is a very unique situation. We have here a country which has been in non-compliance with its safeguards agreements. IAEA has not even yet concluded that Iran is in compliance. Let's not forget about it. They are maintaining sensitive nuclear program, uranium enrichment, with no technical, economical reason. And as you quoted, Mr. Zarif is correct. After 8 years, they will start to emerge from this with much more powerful centrifuges.
Right.
And at the same time, there's no limitation for their missile program. So in my view, we face a situation which needs fixing,
It needs
and to
fixing.
do it is now.
Thank you.
I refer to North Korea. I was watching while the people were rating what happens in North Korea. Now we see where we are today.
On the same path. Thank you very much. Ambassador Wallace, I'm eager to hear your perspective on when Congress should reimpose snapback sanctions. Your written statement did encourage Congress to pass legislation that reaffirms congressional willingness to reimpose sanctions if the deal is not strengthened.
I think that the starting point is what we all learned. This committee really became the expert. We all learned that if you continue to apply pressure with Iran knowing and the business interests around the world knowing that pressure would increase thereafter if compliance wasn't better, I think that's the strategic posture that this committee has to be in. And for lack of a better term, an unfortunate one, it's a target-rich environment when it comes to sanctioning Iran. There's lots of things you can sanction them for. I do believe that there's no reason for them to have a ballistic missile program. Their ballistic missile program is to carry nuclear weapons. It's not part of the agreement, but I don't think any reasonable person could say that long-range ballistic missiles with the warheads that they have are designed ultimately for nuclear weapons. So I think you start with things like designating the Quds Force. I think this committee should start examining their behavior and pushing them back, strictly enforcing the agreement. And when they engage in a violation, it's not a technical violation, it's a violation. And we should indicate that we're willing to impose sanctions if they do.
Absolutely. Violation is a violation. The time to fix the deal is now, not 6 years from now. I thank you very much for all your testimony. Thank you, Madam Chair, for your indulgence.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And now I'm pleased to yield to the ranking member, Mr. Deutsch, for his closing remarks and questions.
I thank the chairman. I want to go back to excuse me, Ambassador Wallace's initial comments about you, Madam Chairman, only to say that I think what happened here today is really an excellent representation of the way that you've conducted this committee. This was an important hearing on a critical issue with excellent witnesses, serious discussion, and very little political grandstanding. This is the way that we need to address, I would suggest, all issues in Congress, but it's absolutely true with respect to Iran. I would also suggest that if you listened really carefully today, you recognize that there is a consensus. There is a consensus. Dr. Heinonen talked about the ways to get access to military sites that currently exist within the deal, and I'd like to explore that in a minute. Dr. Gordon talked about increasing international pressure on Iran's malign activity consistent with the JCPOA and working with our allies. Ambassador Wallace talked about meeting the challenge of Iranian hegemony. There is, as I said in my opening comments, strong bipartisan support to do all of that. And that's the moment that we find ourselves in. But the only comment I would make about the JCPOA and snapback sanctions and throwing out the deal and the threat to walk away from the deal is those very concerns that we have about the sunset provisions that are legitimate, that I share. We're worried about what will happen after 10 years. If we walk away from the deal, those sunset provisions go from 10 years to tomorrow. So I think we need to find ways to recognize this bipartisan commitment to focusing on what Iran is doing, because what Iran is doing right now is an immediate threat to our nation and to our allies. And so there'll be lots of additional discussion about the JCPOA, and I think, I know how strongly people feel about it, but we cannot allow the rehashing of all of the pros and cons of the JCPOA to interfere with our need to go after what I thought was best summed up on the chart that shows Iranian influence spreading throughout the region. And Representative Kinzinger is right, and he knows better than anyone, as someone who faced the fire in battle with Iranian support and Iranian munitions that were responsible for killing American soldiers. He understands the need to take seriously what that map shows: Iran's efforts to expand its influence throughout, its support for terror throughout the region and throughout the world. It's horrific human rights violations. And, as again, my friend Mr. Kinzinger referred to, the fact that it is Iran's support that has helped Assad slaughter 500,000 people. And wherever you are politically in this country, it is impossible to not find that appalling and shocking and recognize it as one of the worst human rights abuses in modern history. So given all of that, I thank the witnesses for a really important discussion, and I hope that we have the opportunity to continue moving forward now. Dr. Heinonen talked about access to the military sites. I mean, Dr. Gordon, the JCPOA provides a means to get access, correct? So, Dr. Heinonen, there is a way. So rather than all of the rhetoric that we've so often heard about how we haven't had access, isn't it appropriate for America to lead the effort with our allies under the JCPOA to get access to those military sites? Yes, it is. I'll continue. And when it comes to increasing sanctions on Iran, don't tell me that I don't accept the Iranian argument that somehow increasing sanctions on Iran for everything that they're doing that's outside the deal violates the deal, when what we were told at the time by everyone involved was that the JCPOA was meant to address the nuclear program in Iran only. And given that that's the case, then, Ambassador Wallace, I completely agree that we should be holding hearings in this committee, and I'll talk to the chairman, and I'm sure we'll find ways to do it, about exactly what those, you've given a couple of ideas, there are lots of others out there, what steps can be taken, starting, by the way, with the legislation that Congress passed during the summer to impose sanctions on Iran, continuing with the legislation that the House is going to pass today to go after Iran's ballistic missile program. We ought to build on that. There's strong bipartisan support for that. And finally, we ought to do exactly what Dr. Gordon says, which is find ways to increase international pressure consistent with the JCPOA and working with our allies. We ought to pursue the offer that we heard coming out of France to find ways outside of the deal to address the sunset clauses, to make clear what American policy is going forward. There's not a lot that I find heartening these days in Congress. This morning's hearing is one such moment. I think there is a lot to build upon to strengthen the terms of the JCPOA without interfering with the relationship that we have with our allies. In fact, to help lead our allies, I think there's a way forward on additional sanctions to block Iran's territorial efforts and their efforts to expand influence throughout the region. I think it's possible to go forward and make sure that the IAEA is being as transparent as they should be and need to be under the deal. And I'm most grateful to you, Madam Chairman, for calling this hearing, and to our three excellent witnesses for giving us the opportunity to start to pursue these. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Deutsch, and we all look forward to supporting your bill on the floor today. Thank you for excellent panelists, and thank you to our audience for being civil throughout. We appreciate it. To our friends in Code Pink, thank you. And with that, the subcommittee is adjourned.